In one of our previous discussions, we talked about Neil Postman's seminal work, Technopoly. In that book, Postman makes the claim that the effect of technology is not additive, but rather transformative to our ecology. That means technology changes almost everything we understand about the world and ushers us into a totally new paradigm which cannot be undone by merely discarding the technology in question. Interestingly, American social psychologist and author Jonathan Haidt, in a way, builds on that idea and identifies social media as one such transformative technology, which has alienated an entire generation of human beings, popularly known as Gen Z, to the extent that it is as if they have been raised on a different planet like Mars as opposed to the Earth. He labels this generation as the anxious generation in his book of the same name, which is the subject of our discussion today.
Jonathan Haidt is one of my favorite writers and thinkers of this generation. And his work, his previous book, I don't know if it's his previous or one before that, but I found The Righteous Mind, for example, to be extremely, extremely insightful and very original in its, and very bold in how he approaches the subject in question. In that also he makes the claim, or he sticks his neck out for group evolution as opposed to individual evolution, and that, doing that in the academia, putting your reputation at stake for believing in certain ideas or for having the guts to state your position clearly. I think he's one of the most sharpest minds in the American academia, and also a great writer, very lucid, very clear in how he approaches complex subjects and how he delineates his own theories and makes complex subjects accessible to common people like us. And in this book also, he's done a phenomenal job. And right from the very start, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, he sets the tone of the book very clearly by making the analogy that technological intervention has almost transformed our environment in such a way that kids born in a certain time period, those he calls the anxious generation, the Gen Z kids, they are almost as if they are being brought up on Mars. Right. And he goes on to further explain his position. But yeah, I mean, this point is very clear. It comes across very clearly, and what he's trying to say here is that technology so completely and so radically and irreversibly changes the natural as well as the cultural ecology that we grow up in, that it is almost as if you are living on a different planet. And what I found to be a very pertinent question that he raises right in the time of the introduction is, when these technologies are being introduced, what kind of research is, at least follows, if not done before, but what kind of research is done after the technology, and are the findings of those studies, do they ever have an impact on the policy? So if that is not done, then we are looking at nothing short of a disaster for human beings when it comes to mental health. So what does he say about, or why do you think the companies have not done any kind of research or taken due precautions before exposing the teenagers and kids to such powerful ways of almost rewiring the mind.
Well, in case of tech companies, for them, age doesn't matter in the sense that every person is a customer. So they are hardly bothered what impact does it have on any section. They are bothered about how much more effectively can their technology be accessible to people. So their motivation is not on that side at all. What he points out is that 40% of American children under 13 have created Instagram accounts. And the laws are not there to address that in USA. Forget having laws in this country. I mean, even the most advanced nations where these technology first came in and the studies on mental health first emerged, they have not bothered to change the laws. They have not bothered to put restrictions on these companies because they are either they are very powerful, or any punitive action against them may be seen as a form of censorship, or letting not people have any avenues and letting the government take control of the channel or the medium of communication altogether. However, what he points out interestingly is that the post-1995 generation, while they were in their teenage, he points out through a biological study that how the mind of a person grows. He said that it grows rapidly till the age of 2. Then it comes to a halt for some time, and during the teenage phase, it grows again, eventually to maturing and cementing to a stable form. This generation of the Generation Z, they were the first generation in mankind who had an access to everything in the world, or rather every information, right in their pockets. This wasn't the case before, because if earlier every form of communication or information that reached out to you happened in a communal form. Let's say if you are watching a television, there's a television in the house. So through 90s, people have watched television. That is the source of their entertainment and their information. You can only access a television when people are around. You cannot have it in a private room because either most people are not that affluent to have TV sets in every room of the house. So most of them have the TV sets in their drawing room. So when they watch or when they consume anything, everybody's aware of what actually the person is consuming and how it is going to impact them on a communal level. So there is a greater chance of conversation and discussion regarding any subject. Whereas in this case, people do not have any idea of what actually is being consumed. It can be good or bad, doesn't matter. But the point is that the atomization and privatization of your sources of entertainment information is severe. And that has proved to be detrimental through multiple studies. Primarily the rise of anxiety level among the people of the age of 18 to 25. The chances of them engaging in self-harm heightening during this period. All of them reflect that the net impact of all this new technology is not very positive for this particular section.
Yeah.
Because he said that he played a devil's advocate and said that let's assume that it brought a new access or new world to these kids who, because their parents or the grandparents never had this access, they can make the best of it and the potentials, and we have seen people making good use of it. But on a general level, if you say that there was no wave of happiness, as he says, when Instagram or these social media came into being, that is after 2010. In 2007, the iPhone came into existence. From there, everything changed. Like you can reach out to people quickly because the touch screen was much more comfortable and accessible to people to use and all that, because the keypad was not very quick. If you have to type a message, it takes a long time, and you would rather be short and you would rather have a more chance of meeting the person in real life than connecting them virtually. Now the virtual connection is much more easier with these kind of innovations, and it all happened within the span of 7-8 years. From 2007 to 2015, it all changed everything. So the difference is quite clear in this case.
So it goes back to the question of what technology is really deployed for. What is the objective with which there is a push for technological evolution? although evolution as such, it has a connotation of spontaneity,
Right.
that because we always think of it as natural evolution. But this is not natural evolution.
Correct.
This is evolution driven by the market. And in that sense, it also speaks volumes about the limits of the free market. And that free market fundamentalists often have, they try to advocate for a position that you can never interfere with the market forces because they are the most rational, all that, and things sort themselves out, and the invisible hand of the market comes in and takes care of everything. That is like the underlying philosophy behind all our economics. Even though there are many schools, even within the free market advocates, that do acknowledge that limit. But in practice, that limit is never set.
Right.
And my original question, going back to that, about why these companies are not doing it, Jonathan Haidt also in this book, he talks about how in the 20th century, when the automobiles were becoming more and more popular and people becoming affordable, at that time, the fuel, the gasoline that was used, petrol, was leaded petrol. And that leaded petrol, they emitted fumes which had a high concentration of lead,
right.
Which eventually, after several decades of allowing those toxic fumes to be simply discarded or let out into the environment,
to be consumed by citizens,
that actually led to a global a decline in the global average IQ.
Right.
That is the kind of impact that it had. Yet people went scot-free, and no punitive action was taken, even after recognizing and even after correcting for what had gone wrong. So in that sense, the corporations are just worried about their profits, and they don't really give a damn for any kind of impact that their products, their technologies, their services may have on the
generations
society,
to come.
On society at large. So that, I think, is now pretty much a norm, and everyone recognizes that. The other thing that you talked about was this the breakdown of community, and how from radio to television was one jump. Where when you listen to the radio, even today, you go to rural parts of India also. So people, if they listen to the radio, there is a sense of collective, because you're not totally, your visual attention is not engaged. It's only the auditory part. But television is the next jump. And now with the smartphones, you have even broken that barrier where people earlier watched television together. Now that also is not there. So kids, they grow, they watch whatever comes their way on their smartphones, and there is no way to filter information. At least no reasonable way. Although in theory there might be, like you have these fake consent forms and parental locks and all that, but in practice it doesn't work.
How tough it is to break
them. Correct. So that is one thing, and the other is, of course, the larger point of how the whole this idea of living in families. We are talking about families now, not even communities.
Correct.
And family today in the American system, a family is by default the nuclear family.
Right.
But really speaking, a nuclear family is no family. Because a lot of research has already happened, even in the West, which suggests that unless there are 3 generations
under a roof,
biologically related, living under the same roof, you cannot call it a family, because the cultural transmission happens from the
alternate generations.
It skips one generation. So if you're not living with your grandparents, then you might as well take it for granted that you are not receiving the wisdom of the ages. And so it's pretty tragic, and the commentary reflects that. But yeah, I mean, despite the gloom, I think he still has an optimistic
Right.
way of looking at things. So yeah.
I mean, with this only, there is another link that we can draw, and that is the second chapter of the book, which is the absence of childhood, or the great rewiring of childhood, which was a play-based childhood, has been taken over by a phone-based childhood. That is, if you do not have grandparents, where, I mean, the concern of in a nuclear family is that they won't let the child to go out. Primarily, that is the major concern, and that is something which has aggravated over 2-3 decades, if we can say. That even in 90s or in 2000s, you had you could find a lot of children in parks and
Correct.
playgrounds.
Correct.
That is not the case anymore.
Yeah.
Or even if there are, the number of children are not there anymore, or the kind of unsupervised play that they used to engage in, it is no longer there. Either it is, I mean, it's a supervised sport or some team activity which has been mandated by a institution. Let's say school has mandated that this, you guys have to play this time around, then only. But on their own, the child doesn't have or doesn't exercise the kind of agency. The only place he exercises agency is when he's using a phone, because the parent has no agency. So that is a kind of a great rewiring which has happened over 2 decades, if we can say. The 2000s were different, 2010s have totally changed. And after the pandemic, when everybody was glued only to their screens, there's no going back. Almost
Correct.
There's no going back.
Correct. No, you also talked about the way in which the human brain evolves. And he mentions in the book that by the age of 5, human children have already developed 90% of their brain mass. So the rest of the life, it's only 10%. So majority of the brain development happens by 5. Also, he compares it with chimpanzees and says that in the case of chimpanzees, it's a uniform growth. The pace is all very uniform. But in humans, like you said, it stops changing after 2, and by 5 it's 90%. And then there is a period of kind of a stability. There is a lull, and children are kind of stuck in the same cognitive world. And that is because
also there's a sudden jump at the time of puberty.
Correct. I was coming to that. So he says here, when he compares it with chimpanzees, he says, but human children wait. They grow rapidly for the first 2 years, slow down for the next 7 to 10, and then undergo a rapid growth spurt during puberty before coming to a halt a few years later. Intriguingly, a child's brain is already 90% of its full size by around age 5. Then, further down in the chapter, he says, our brains grew larger because the race for survival was won no longer by the fastest or strongest, but by those most adept at learning. Our planet-changing trait was the ability to learn from each other and tap into the common pool of knowledge our ancestors and community had stored. And then further down, which is very important, he says, in other words, evolution has provided humans an extended childhood that allows for a long period of learning the accumulated knowledge of one society, a kind of cultural apprenticeship during adolescence before one is seen and treated as an adult. So now social media interactions and all this period of learning, this stable period of learning, is characterized by free play. Spontaneous free play, and we discussed this in another book which was on diversity. So not having free play has a direct impact on diversity as well, because all children stop learning.
There's zero interaction.
There is zero interaction. There is no learning, and so everyone kind of becomes like zombies. So, but he asks the question, why social media interactions cannot be considered to be free play, because ultimately you're still engaged with other people in the virtual world. Now, there are 2 things to it. One, that there is no physical dimension. You are not using all your senses while interacting with it. And in the real world, there are consequences. Like 2 children playing, they get into a fight, they quarrel, they might even hit each other, and but they will negotiate a workaround, and they will still collaborate.
Right.
And this is almost like animals, like dogs, small puppies, we see them fighting. All animals, all mammals especially.
Correct.
The young ones are always
Quarreling.
engaged in free play. They're trying to be aggressive, they're trying to be reconciliatory all the time.
Right.
And that is how their bonds are formed, and that is how they learn to negotiate the world they live in.
Right.
They find they find ways of negotiating with predators, avoiding predators, and also forming bonds with allies. The same goes true for children also. But the social media does not provide that opportunity, because what the structure of social media is such that you are free to disengage from an unpleasant conversation.
Correct. There's an escape route.
There is always an escape route. And thirdly, there are no real consequences of bad behavior.
Right.
So which is why trolling is so ubiquitous.
Right.
Everyone is free to air their opinion, no matter how obnoxious it might be. And you can abuse, you can, call people names, you can slander, you can defame
because that is what gets boosted in the environment.
Yes. And plus the shell of anonymity also gives you that, power. So in doing all that, the reputation or the social reputation of users is so much at stake that they are not able to freely engage in, a virtual free play.
Right.
They cannot, because they're always thinking strategically about how to project a certain image so that that image is safe.
There's a very fine line saying that life on the platforms forces young people to become their own brand managers.
Right. Exactly.
So every text is a strategic move. Yeah, you can say they are playing a new dimensional chess.
Yeah.
Rather than actually engaging in kind of a learning activity.
True. And so the direct consequence of that is he also shows it graphically in a book based on some study that from 91 to 2017, meeting up with friends has really dropped by, I don't know the exact number, but
in boys it's gone down from above 40 to just about 20, like 20% drop.
Wow. That's actually 50%.
50% drop.
50% drop, yeah. Now,
same in case of boys and girls, it's common.
So, going back to the claim, the major claim of this book, which is to say that social media usage among teenagers of the Gen Z has led to depression and has led to other mental issues.
Right.
So he actually does not just make the claim, he backs it up with data as well. And there are several studies that he quotes. And he shows that, especially in the US, for example, that there is a major rise in the depression among teens. And this rise is very sharp, especially after 2015.
Correct.
So this is people who have entered puberty around the time, around 2015, and have been exposed, have several years of exposure to the social media.
Correct.
Similarly, anxiety prevalence by age and other forms of depression are also seeing a spike. Now he says that, okay, you might say that, these are all very sorry. People tend to dismiss that as, these days people, they talk about mental issues all the time.
That's why they've been recognized.
But he's talking about actual physical harm also, that emergency room visits for self-harm also saw a similar spike. And more so among girls. Right. And then he talks about the suicide rates. The suicide rates have also seen a spark in this time period only. So all factors and all indicators paint the same picture, a very bleak picture of
there's too much data to be discarded.
Yeah, absolutely. Too much data to be discarded. Very well said. So,
one thing I want to bring your attention to, other than fair play, it is called attunement. I didn't get this part, to be honest.
Okay.
because he says that human children are wired to connect in
Right.
part by tuning and synchronizing their movements and emotions
Right.
with others. Now I'm saying that in case of social media, don't we say attunement at the highest? Because we are imitating the people around us in most of the cases. Let's say sending a snap. So
Right.
everybody sends the snap. So that is a greater attunement exercise.
So in this section of attunement, he writes that human children are wired to connect in part by tuning and synchronizing their movements and emotions with others. So he gives an example of how parents or how adults, when they interact with babies, so they do some funny gestures and the baby laughs. So that kind of builds a bond between the adult and the baby, and the baby finds joy in that interaction, and the adult also finds a different kind of joy, right? And this is like a coupling between the two, and done over and over again, repetitively. That is what how the relationship evolves.
Right.
And obviously, other than the genetic and the biological connection that parents and siblings have with within the family, this social attunement is extremely important in building those bonds of trust.
Right.
Now, then he also talks about how free play is so important in this attunement business, because free play is unsupervised and unorganized play. Right. It is not like, these days children are, because they don't go out into the parks to play and, spend time with each other, unsupervised, without any adults hovering over them. So now the kids often enroll themselves in stadiums and, sports clubs and, start learning sports early on. But that is almost like school. There is no unstructured play. Right. So unstructured play could be competitive and it could be non-competitive. So competitive play would be like, games like, we used to play Pagdan Pakadai and hide and seek and things like that, which are exciting and which have their own rules. And there is a winner, but there is a lot of, it's not really direct competition. Book. It's not direct competition. There are rules.
But there's no defined rule book that it has to be played.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah. So, and the other is, there are games which do not even have a clear winner.
Right.
And this is especially more prevalent among girls.
Right.
They do all those, clapping and, synchronizing activities. And then they have rhymes. I remember I used to play with my cousin sister when we were back in Kashmir. And these used to be really fun things to do.
Correct.
And you also develop motor skills while doing it, tuck, 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 all that, how kids do these things. So these skipping and clapping games, they don't have a clear winner, but they build that connection between kids engaged in these activities. Right. And the most important part of these activities and these games is that synchronicity, that it is all synchronized, that all the people who are participating, the activity has their undivided attention. Right. That is what is missing on the social media, because social media is in itself a distraction from the real world. And then in this distraction, you are not engaging with people in real time. That there is asynchronicity in the very interaction. You get a message, you can wait, you can, so it's not like real time. And you can manipulate your own behavior, which is how you project a certain image. Right. Let's say you tell me something offensive and I get angry. In the real world, I will deal with it in a different way. Right. And on social media, I will wait, maybe let things settle.
And then retaliate.
With more venom. Right? So, and plus again, on the social media, the stakes are low. Because you're not really, unless you know the person and you're doing things together in real life, most of the interactions, let's say on Twitter, most of the interactions are with strangers. Right. So with strangers, you have nothing to lose. And the way in which you interact is different. Now with kids, especially, at least with adults, they have more experience of the world,
Right.
and especially of the previous generation. But with kids who are only exposed to social media, they are completely removed from this bond building, from this trust building sort of free play and these activities, synchronous activities, and that leads to what we are just talking about. It is also interesting that as we after graduating from school, this new era of this new technopolic, actually technopoly is older than that, but this new information age,
Correct.
I think it has also had an impact on many behaviors or many social norms, like the ever-growing popularity of social drinking.
Right.
So earlier generations, at least in India, friends could just meet up and
Right.
just talk about their lives. Now in the urban areas and metros, especially in my circle,
Right.
I see that I cannot meet my school friends without having alcohol, or without invite them
Inviting
asking
for a drink.
for a
Right.
drink. So it's inconceivable in certain circles to even meet old friends without drinking.
Cause of imitation behavior?
No, because there is a lack of connection.
Okay.
And this lack of connection is because you have not engaged in that kind of
relationship,
association, and being in the same place and having your undivided attention at the same time. So now you have to get intoxicated for you to be able to do that.
Conversation,
for you to be able to do that. So that I think is also a consequence of
so that you don't get distracted to anything.
Correct. You feel better because alcohol gives you a certain euphoria,
right.
And that euphoria makes you more amenable, and you can talk to more. It makes you sociable, right? And if you were already healthy that way, and then you don't need alcohol, right?
Right. One more thing that comes in the same chapter, and that is social learning. So he writes that social media platforms are the most efficient conformity engines ever invented.
Right.
So Sean Parker, one of the early leaders of Facebook, admitted to create a social validation feedback loop. Exactly the kind that a hacker like myself would come up with, because you are exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology.
Right.
So there's an important diagram that is there in this book itself, which is about how it all gets connected in a loop. That is, you get a notification first, then you see a certain post, then you have to react to that post or do a counter post of your own, and then you wait for a feedback of other people on the same post. If there's no feedback, then you'll again go and post, and once the feedback is complete, then a notification comes and the circle again works. So every message or everything that we are putting out, it is for people to react and validate our belief, our point, or whatever we want the validation for. And the circle just goes endlessly and continues throughout. There is no break in that circle unless one is determined to shut his phone off and just put it away for some time. But the moment he switches it on again, the loop will again trigger again.
Correct.
And that is the, I guess, one of the most powerful invention or innovation that these people have actually succeeded at.
When I read that part, what struck me was also, it's not the author who says this, but this thought came to me that the behavior, what Parker has talked about here, that you kind of use the vulnerability of human psychology, and you end up incentivizing people to amass influence. Right. Everyone wants to be an influencer on social media, right? Because it seems that influencers have something which we don't, and this influence amassing is actually very useful for the whole advertising and this whole capitalistic consumerist setup, where you need channels and you need you need ways in which your products and services can reach people, right? Advertising in a different form.
Right.
So these influencers become those nodes or those carriers of the advertising virus. And so it's a self-fulfilling kind of cycle that you create influencers, and these influencers are again used in the service of the big machine, which is the whole advertising and consumerist industry. So that way also, at a deeper level, this is more vicious than even what he talks about.
Correct. I mean, it has somehow become a self-sustainable thing.
It has.
And the only thing that it extracts is the mental sanity of a person.
Yeah, because it hijacks attention.
Right.
When attention is hijacked, then there is nothing really left. It's almost like it sucks off the cognitive power of the human species and uses it for purely commercial objectives.
Correct. So, in the next chapter, he talks about, or he pits two modes of human mind against each other.
Right.
One is of a discoverer, the other is of a defender. So discover mode and defend mode. Basically, he said that if you come across a tree full of ripe fruits and cherries, you would feel hungry and you would try to climb that tree and maybe probably eat that fruit. But if you heard the sound of an animal approaching, you'll rather think in a defend mode and you'll restrict yourself and you'll try to flee or whatever. What he says that in the era of post-1990s, when safetyism, like the safety itself, became an ideology that we need to protect the children from society, so to say, which is because it is eminently bad. There's a lot of negative influence in society and we cannot let them go out. This discoverer mode somehow got paralyzed, and the only mode that the children's mind can activate was defend. So the new experiences, or which a generation before them had, or they understood how to tackle things, or whenever the problem arises, that is missing completely in this late millennials and Gen Z generation. And that is directly linked to how parents or the generations have actually formulated the childhood of their next. Basically, he also mentions this concept of Nassim Taleb, the anti-fragile concept. And he says that, so anti-fragile, Taleb says there are three kinds of systems. One is fragile, which will break when the uncertainty hits. The second is robust, which will withstand uncertainty and resist uncertainty as much as it could, which eventually breaking at some point of time. And the third is the anti-fragile system, which sort of uses that uncertainty for its own growth. That is the human immune system. Whenever we get sick or have a disease, our body learns about it more. And once it has overcome that disease, it is now fully capable to prevent its attack anytime, or it will not get sick. That is how generally an immune system works. Similarly, he says that kids are also, Haidt says that kids are also anti-fragile. Once they have encountered a problem and once they have overcome that, they are much more capable, they are much more wiser to deal with it if it encounters or if it comes again.
Yeah.
And
so, yeah, please.
And preventing them from actually getting into this discover mode kills their anti-fragile and makes them fragile.
Yes.
Or maybe robust. If they are strong enough, they can be robust to some extent.
Right.
But eventually they are fragile. And the entire Gen Z, if we can call them, they are fragile because, especially in case of when they are in social media.
Correct. So this the comparison with the human immune system is very apt. I don't know if you've heard of this disease called the Crohn's disease.
Okay.
And the Crohn's disease is a very scary autoimmune disorder where this is not a medical explanation, so forgive me if it's not technically accurate, but it's, in a sense, it's the body eating up its own digestive system. So the intestines kind of melt into the body, and it's also fatal if it's not prevented from spreading. So the Crohn's disease, interestingly, is correlated with hygiene. If you are too clean, if you're growing up in too clean an environment where you have no exposure whatsoever to microbes, then there is a higher likelihood of the onset of this disease, which is counterintuitive. But this analogy is very similar to that, that you need exposure to risks and you need exposure to danger for you to be able to learn to negotiate them, which is what we were just talking about when children engage in free play and they rough and tumble and all that goes alongside. If they don't have that kind of experience, then they grow up to be fragile individuals. In this book, Jonathan Haidt actually plots two parallel graphs. One is about the impact of social media, and the other is also this rise of overprotective parenting. And both these things have a devastating impact on the mental health of Gen Z. But actually, if you look at it, both these originate from the same point, which is the breakdown of communities and even families. And he also makes the point in the book that earlier, in previous generations, in your neighborhood itself, you had elders who were not biologically related to you, who would step in and correct bad behavior and lecture other people's children that this is not how you do it, and mind your language and things like that. Just there was a social pressure to conform with societal norms and what is considered good behavior. That has declined because the trust that individuals, adults have with each other has declined, and that is directly attributable to the loss of community. And with the growing individualism and isolation, the crimes have also increased. So you cannot deny that. And in that sense, it's very difficult to put a finger on where is the original cause, because it's all circular. And it's such a messy circle that you don't know where to start, right? It's a systemic problem, as most of the problems around us these days are. So you can't do anything about it. But that is how it is. And if and the other thing that you spoke about was this two mechanisms of what is the defense
and
so
discover.
Behavioral activation system, which is called the discover mode, and behavioral inhibition system, which is called the defense mode. This also corresponds with the classic flight or fight trigger or the switch that we have inside us. We come across a situation where we feel threatened, or we have a challenge in front of us. We either flee, run away, or we fight it, right? We fight it if we think that we have a winning chance. We flee if we don't. So this is very normal biology that every species has in some ways. Now, what he says is that the discover mode or this fight mode is inhibited in this current generation because of a long or lack of exposure to learning about how to fight or how to negotiate with these situations, going back to the problem of not having free play and all that. And parents being overprotective. He calls it helicopter parenting, I think. Kind of helicopter parenting, where you are looking out for your child all the time. And
can be CCTV parenting as well.
CCTV parenting, and that because of that, when these children grow up, they don't even know how to deal with situations. So they are always in the inhibitory or the flight mode. So any problem that they come across, their instinct is to just get the hell out of there, right? They will not, and that's why they're called snowflakes. Because they'll just melt at the first touch of warmth. So that thing, although it's funny, but it's also tragic that this is what we have now come to as a society. And you see that also in India.
Decades of ignorance have resulted this.
Yes, absolutely. And if you look at it civilizationally, then this is like karma paying the West a visit, because every culture has both these modes, in a collective sense. You have the discover mode, you have the inhibitory mode. But in this expansionist phase, in the post-industrial imperialist age, they've completely forgot that there is an inhibitory mode also where you have to stop somewhere. So that disregard for any limits we see in economics, we see in technology, and we even see in individuals
social behavior.
Social behavior.
Right.
And now that because they have for so long been so aggressive and one-sided about things, now their own societies are collapsing, and ironically, their new generations have completely given up on actual discovery, and now they're completely overwhelmed by the flight mode, and they've surrendered to it.
Absolutely. I mean, one more thing that he mentions is that something that emerged on college campuses was emotional safety. And this is what we generally term as the woke culture.
Correct.
Where we do not want to trigger someone by using a certain kind of word.
Right.
Because the use of that word offends him and institutes a generational trauma of some sorts, and therefore we must give a very protected environment to every individual. So much to say that there has to be specific pronouns, and if you address a person with a different pronoun, that in itself hurts the person or impacts the mental stability or the dignity itself.
The
idea of dignity itself.
And so I mean, you are much younger to me, so you may have a better idea of how this thing works, but to me it is totally incomprehensible. I just fail to understand how someone can get triggered by, I think my generation at least. Actually, I don't know. but it's, I mean, personally speaking now, I can't speak for others, but personally speaking, this is inconceivable.
Correct.
And this is a result of all these factors that we've been talking about here. Helicopter parenting and social media, this concoction combined has resulted in this. But safetyism and the concept, I mean, when I compare today's school-going kids, my own son and my nephews and nieces, and I compare them with my own thing. At my age, this becomes a habit that you always compare. In my good old days. But that comparison actually there's a stark contrast that they are so dependent on adults for every single thing, which was not the case when we were growing up. And this is I think because we lag behind America by a couple of decades. Right. So it's even more pertinent to us, or it sounds more believable to us whatever he's written, because when I read this, I see it happening in front of me. So this is what is happening in India now, and I can't imagine how 20 years later, what kind of society we will have. It is a scary thought.
Right. Chapter 4 is about puberty and the blocked transition to adulthood. Now, here's an interesting thing that he mentions. And he says that despite enormous variation in human cultures and gender roles, there is a common structure to puberty rites because they are all trying to do the same thing. Transform a girl into a woman or a boy into a man who has knowledge, skills, virtue, and social standing to be an effective member of the community, soon to be ready for marriage and parenthood. Basically, placing the responsibility of taking the community forward is what marks this transition. And it has followed across cultures. The rituals or anything, they may differ, but the fundamental idea or the meta theme of all of it is same. Now, here is a point where they need what he calls as social role models, that is community role models, which are other than his or her parents, and to who he could imitate or from whom he could learn and gather some kind of insight to be a to be a much more competent, not competent is not the right word, useful member of the society, or contribute to the society to or community in the way he is expected to. That is something which has completely changed in case of social media, because the transition phase is not visible. The moment he gets a phone, the transition starts happening, and the pace of it is forget being constant, is not even. You can't even make sense when the transition has actually happened, or what he has got access to. So the entire transformation into a man has gone haywire. And it's a bits and pieces of everything that has been attached together, even as the person grows up and gets into his 20s, and maybe in America maybe in 30s.
Right. So there is a huge flood of information that kids are exposed to. And like he remarks in the book, on the internet, no one has any age.
Correct.
There's just one universal age, and that is common to everyone. And so, in that sense, because there is no age recognized by the internet, or at least in any meaningful way, he does talk about the those consent forms that you have,
18 years,
13 years, 18 years, whatever it is, but that does not work. So kids are exposed to all kinds of information, which in a conventional society is withheld from them, because it does not. It is not compatible with their cultural evolution, or at their age, or at their level of cultural understanding. So when you disregard all those filters of information, then you end up leaving the child at the mercy of all this information coming his way, and then not really helping out with sorting it. Because again, there are no role models. And in the virtual world, you really have no real connections. So imagine a child being exposed to all kinds of this information, and then no way, and there is no guidance to sort this information into meaningful clusters, so that you could make sense of the world. So you end up as a teenager believing that life is just meaningless struggle. And I think that is the only coherent response that anyone with a thinking mind could come up with. And so, having relegated culture to a place of lip service, that there is something called culture. There is actually no culture, and it is all technological compulsions that you are, that you are carrying the burden of.
And with culture itself is a tool of social signaling it has been reduced.
Yeah, because it is now like Postman wrote in that book that its culture has surrendered to technology. So culture is just a handmaiden of technology. So technology transforms culture, and technopolic culture is uniform all across the world. There are no rites of passage, as he said. There is no way in which, because there is no age, so there is no way in which you self-identify at a particular age and say that, okay, this is how society expects me to behave, and this is how it is supposed to be. So yeah, so all in all, it's very scary and threatening. And if nothing is done about it quickly, then we are looking at entire generations being laid to waste.
So one of the subtopic of this is puberty, plasticity, and vulnerability. There he says that brain development beyond the age of 5 is not about overall growth, but about the selective tuning of neurons and synapses, leaving only the ones that have been frequently used. Brain researchers say that neurons wire together. A second kind of brain change that occurs during childhood is called myelination, which refers to coating of axons of neurons with insulating sheath of fatty material, which makes transmission faster across long distance connections in those constellations of neurons.
Right. So basically, it's I think he's talking about learning generally, and how learning happens how that happens at a neurological level. So your neurons transmit information, and by the time that you are age 5, you've already done the
basics of it.
Basic general brain development is already done. What happens after that is very interesting, that you are exposed to environmental situations and stimuli that cause certain neurons to fire.
Right.
And your response to those situations and repetitive response to those situations makes those neurons fire together.
Right.
And when they fire together, that repeatedly, that becomes a behavioral pattern.
Right.
Also, this myelination that he talks about is that even if the neurons are physically wide apart, yet so in clusters of neurons, obviously, it has evolved in such a way that the clusters of neurons deal with similar situations. But when you are dealing with a situation which requires, let's say, a very non-conventional or a culturally more evolved approach.
Right.
One is a biological approach, which is more instinctive. Then the cultural approach is one where you have to think through stuff and then respond. A repetition of those behaviors makes neurons which may be physically apart also fire together. But once that is done again and again, that there is a connection which happens between these distant neurons and it becomes a spontaneous behavior. So that is how you learn and you acquire certain traits which may not exactly be biologically driven. Right. That is where culture comes into play. So it's interesting that when you deny children a direct experience of danger through this thing called safetyism, that there is safety first all the time, and helicopter parenting. So if you deny children that opportunity of dealing with dangers, those are limited dangers, but they will not kill you, but they'll make you stronger, right? So if you deny that culture of denial renders them absolutely useless in real life, because then when they grow up, those neurons do not fire.
Right. So if they encounter a certain similar problem, or the problem that they should have encountered a decade ago,
yes,
if they're encountering it a decade later, they have no clue how to deal with it.
And by that time, it's already too late.
Right.
So because it is only during the puberty when or before that
they could have been shaped.
That these behaviors develop.
Right.
That these neurons develop some sort of a connection between each other. And these neural pathways are generated. If they don't get generated on time, then they never get generated. Like, for example, if you look at language acquisition, before, I think you also mentioned that before 10, children tend to learn multiple languages very quickly, because that is the time when the brain allows for your evolutionary model. I mean, the evolutionary scheme of things has allowed for children to learn multiple languages, because that is how you deal with the world, and that is how evolution has shaped human human species.
Language gives you a certain introduction to a culture.
Correct.
So your cultural words or the meanings of it gets ingrained at that point.
So, but after 10, it becomes increasingly difficult to acquire a new language, because nature has then decided that ho gaya. Now it's not the time to do
Basically, you cannot experience a new culture in a much more simpler or a lucid way.
Correct.
So that you accumulate the entire trait of the language.
Correct.
Unless you are very high.
Yeah, of course. I mean, those are exceptions. But generally speaking, you don't acquire language skills so easily in adulthood as you do in childhood. And the reason for that is also the same.
So the next chapter just illustrates what the great rewiring happened. And he calls it the 4 foundational harms: social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction. These are the 4 things that are the direct consequence of a phone-based childhood. In case of social deprivation, he mentions that when a Canadian college student wrote to him that Gen Z are an incredibly isolated group of people. Oftentimes, I'll arrive early to a lecture to find a room of 30 plus students sitting together in complete silence. absorbed in their smartphones, afraid to speak and be heard by their peers.
Wow.
We can see a similar thing in social gathering also. That
Right.
often, if you visit a social gathering where you are not very familiar, it's not your immediate family members' function, and you could see a lot of people actually engaging in
No, these days even immediate
family members.
So these days it's like, interesting that he talks about it as the great rewiring, because it is not just the rewiring of children's brain,
Right.
but also adults
Correct.
who have now transformed into these people staring at their own phones all the time and not interacting, which is why I mentioned the rise in social drinking and
Correct.
things like that. So yes, it's almost an epidemic,
Right.
of sorts.
Because one would expect at least a classroom to be full of chatter,
Yeah.
a noise coming from that, and that was the biggest complaint of teachers.
Yeah.
When I was a student.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And suddenly it has stopped, and
Yeah.
it has not stopped for good. I mean, contrary to what they would expect, it hasn't stopped for good. It has.
बोल रहे भाई बोल लो यार तुम बात क्यों नहीं करते? जैसे वो आनंद पिक्चर में अमिताभ बच्चन लास्ट में बोलता है उसको, तो मेरा सर खा गया लेकिन अब बात करो.
That end of tragedy only.
Yeah, it is that. And the sleep deprivation is very, very obvious.
Correct.
Staring at these screens.
Binge watching.
Correct. Binge watching,
the
and
whole term came into existence.
And even that exposure to those
Screens.
to the screens actually has a negative impact on your sleep.
I mean, how intentional this is on part of these companies is clear from the point that the CEO of Netflix put it on an earnings call with investors, and he quotes the CEO: "We are competing with sleep on the margin."
Wow.
Like, think about it. When you watch a show from Netflix and you get addicted, you stay up late at night. So we are not competing with other people. We are competing with your sleep.
Right.
And that is the model of that is the revenue model.
And then there is the harm number 3, which is attention fragmentation.
Correct.
That also follows from this also.
Sleep deprivation.
Sleep deprivation and attention fragmentation. Attention fragmentation also because you are hooked to notifications and
correct.
Things. So it has multiple contributing factors.
They say that you have to shut your brain from the work, go back to that notification, read that, and if allowed, you can come back to the work.
Right.
Because that constant notification buzzing in wouldn't let you have the single-minded focus to any work.
Yeah.
And this kind of a multitask is not possible if you are just scrolling and working.
Yes. And plus, and the the last one being addiction is of course the most serious of all these problems, and it is again it is abundantly clear why.
Right.
It is especially more dangerous for teenagers and children.
Right.
For the same reason that we were talking about just now, that when your neural networks are still developing, at that time, if you're exposed to this kind of attention hijacking technology, then you are repeatedly doing the same thing. You're repeatedly looking at notifications. You're repeatedly not engaging in productive work or in boring, slow work. Because you want that immediate gratification.
Correct.
And because of that, as you grow up, you are completely screwed.
Correct.
Because you have never learned to engage your neurons. Don't fire in a way to engage you with slow, boring work. So you have attention issues.
There's no concept of delayed gratification. It has to be impulsive every time.
So it has to be, your biology will force you to look for instant gratification.
Right. I mean, he mentions that the neural basis of behavioral addiction to social media or video games is not exactly the same as chemical addictions to cocaine or opiate. Yet it must be noted that the creators of these apps use every trick in psychologist toolkit to hook users as deeply as slot machine hook gamblers. So basically it's gambling kind of addiction that you get used to it. You want to win more.
True.
Or if you haven't won, then you are playing just to win in the hope of winning at some time.
Correct.
again, advertisers do this all the time.
Yes, it starts off with advertising only. I mean, this hijacking of attention is it started off with the advertising industry,
right?
And there is a book by Jerry Mander called the 5 Reasons to Ban Television.
Right.
I think we should do it one of the future episodes. And he's an advertising professional, and he writes about, and he gave it up because he couldn't take it anymore.
Right.
And that advertising also is where the seeds were sown. And with the growth of technology and the increasing power of technology, now that intent to hijack attention has amplified by 1,000 or 10,000, whatever factor.
Probably because the advertisement doesn't address need, it creates.
No, because the medium is different.
I'm saying that ads, the intention of advertisement is to create a want for the product.
Yes.
So it has to strike a person so as to stimulate her to get him to actually buy the product or service.
Correct.
Similarly, social media.
And so that is why advertisements are not really about products, but more about aspirations and lifestyle choices and things like that. And often they use sexually stimulating images to hijack your attention. Right. It's the same principle.
Correct. Here's the model: the trigger, action, variable, reward, and investment model.
Right, exactly. They teach it in business schools, right? In MBA, they have this model. I don't know if it's the current model or whatever, but they have this IDA: attention, interest, decision, and action.
Right.
So this corresponds with this trigger, action, variable, reward, investment in some way, I think. I am not an MBA graduate, so I don't I don't know, but yes, I heard from some friends that this is what they use.
And it says that Facebook intentionally hooked teens using behaviorist techniques. Thanks to the Facebook files, the trove of internal documents and screenshots of presentation brought out by whistleblower Frances Haugen in 2021. That Facebook case that happened. That
correct.
How they are intentionally building.
There is a documentary also on that, no? What is it called?
Yeah, there's a Netflix documentary. I forgot the names, but similar. So next 2 chapters describe how social media impacts the 2 genders differently. Now, this will not be comfortable for people who don't believe in gender differences and gender roles. But it mentions a very interesting thing, and that is agency and communion. Researchers have long found that boys and men are focused on agency, while girls and women are more focused on communion. Agencies arise from striving to individuate and expand the self and involves qualities such as efficiency, competence, and assertiveness. Communion arises from striving to integrate the self in a larger social unit through caring for others and involves qualities such as benevolence, cooperativeness, and empathy. So here's a clear demarcation between how the 2 would access the world.
Right.
While in case of a girl, it will be more about the social validation loop or the group that has been formed, that how much they kind of give importance to her personality. Her meaning, her purpose comes from that. In case of a man, it comes from the assertive nature, actually seeing him as the more powerful or more dominant personality in a group of peers, or if not even peers, then generally on social platforms. So both get hooked onto a different kind of addiction. In case of a girl, the addiction is mainly about, let's say Instagram is an addiction where you get likes on basis of how you look. In case of a boy, the addiction is mainly coming from video games where he has an agency of winning.
Right.
So both of them have this clear demarcation, and both of them are vulnerable due to these specific devices, or we can say these specific innovations that have rendered them vulnerable.
Right. So social media or generally the internet engages boys and girls in different ways.
In different ways.
That is very obvious when you look at any analytics of any YouTube channel or any Twitter handle or whatever. That's very obvious. And that it is also equally plain that there will be different hooks for them. And that there will be different ways in which their respective attentions will be hijacked. So yes, he makes very fair points about this difference, this biological difference. Differentiation is always there, and it's very logical that social media will hijack it in different ways. And what he further elaborates on is that girls tend to have a higher need, like you said, of self-validation, and therefore they are more attracted to apps like Instagram, where they can post their selfies and get validation from the crowd for the beauty, and they measure themselves against impossible standards of beauty. Then they also have filters,
which has to beautify them, enhance their beauty.
So all that, and then of course, boys tend to get more attracted to video games because there's a
basically
sense
a
of
winning.
There is this this book called by this author called Roy Baumeister. It's called Are Men Good for Anything? No, just give me 1 second. Is there anything good about men? And it was written, I think, about 10 years back or something. And this basically makes a distinction between how the two gender roles evolved. And he says that women, they tend to form very close bonds within their gender, and they commit themselves emotionally to those bonds, but they form very less bonds. I don't know how whether this theory is without flaws, but this is an interesting take actually. So he says that is what happens, and because of that commitment to forming deeper bonds and emotional connects, they become nurturers. While men, they tend to form more superficial but large scale bonds, because they have to interact with other tribes, other cultures, and set the rules of engagement. And so that has to be at a common minimum denominator. Of course, it does not rule them out from investing in emotional relationships, but that is very few. But women primarily do that, and
it also is visible in their forms of aggression. Like in case of a woman, there's an indirect aggression, whereas in a case of a man, there's a direct. The nature of direct confrontation is much more.
I think he mentions
this.
So I think you should clarify before people jump at you and say that.
Okay, no, this is mentioned by Jonathan Haidt. Correct. He says that he mentions in the point of communion itself that communion is formed because there's an indirect aggression.
Correct.
And agency is where there's a direct confrontation. You are challenging someone, which is visible in video games also, because it virtually gives you the sense of victory. It gives you the power.
Correct.
So you are not interacting as a team. I mean, although if you see in team sports, men are excelling in team sports, but that is primarily because they want to the purpose of winning is higher than any of bond or whatever they want to form. So the bond is formed in order to secure that purpose. Whereas in case of a knitted community with a close circle, that is much more visible in case of women.
Right. So he talks about 4 reasons why girls are particularly vulnerable on social media, and he says that 1, they are more affected by visual social comparison and perfectionism. 2, that what you said, girls' aggression is more relational. That there is indirect aggression, and that means that for depressed or ostracized teens, physical death offers the end of pain, whereas social death is a living hell. So that is why there is a rise in suicide rates.
And that's a very shocking statement.
Reason number 3 is girls more easily share emotions and disorders.
Because the group is contagious.
Happiness is contagious. And so they tend to become, depression was significantly more contagious than happiness or good mental health. So when a woman became depressed, it increased the odds of depression in her close friends also, because they spread it, while men keep it to themselves.
Right.
They tend to keep it to themselves, so it does not spread that way. And 4, that girls are more subject to predation and harassment. That is very, very obvious, because on online or offline, that they are the more vulnerable of the two genders. So
the greater reliance on defend mode.
Yes. So they.
Right.
Exactly. Now, in the case of boys, the issues are slightly different,
right,
but they are equally serious, and that has to do with also with the value that is attributed to male qualities and male traits by society as such. In the post-industrial world, the strength of the physical strength of males is not so much
the defining factor, correct.
So it's the value has reduced. The kind of physical labor that men used to do earlier is no longer required, because machines have taken over. So the value of men in society, or at least their economic worth, has certainly declined. And because of that, the culture has changed.
Right.
And now, it does not, obviously, it does not mean that because now girls and boys are kandhe se kandha milakar, shoulder to shoulder, they're working together and taking the world by storm. But this is not necessarily that the decline in male values or the worth of males, that decline is not necessarily good for women also,
right? Because
ultimately it's a yin yang. There's mutually complementary roles, and if one declines, the other is not going to benefit
from it.
So he in this chapter on boys, he has a specific section on boys who fail to launch. And this, I'll quote him directly, that Americans have long used the term failure to launch to describe anyone who gets off track, doesn't find employment, and ends up living back with their parents for an indefinite period of time. And this, the more formal term for this is NEET, which is not in education, employment, or training. So he talks about Japanese boys who tend to be like that. And they become more and more isolated, and they find no reason to interact with other people in society, and they turn inwards and just stick to their.
There's a very strong resonating parallel with India if we compare. He says that so in the 90s, when the bubble of economy of 1980s of Japan popped and hurdles to success became higher, young men retreated to their childhood bedrooms and shut their doors.
Right.
Similarly, we can say that there's bubble in 2000s and sudden change in the society when everything opened up, and now the pressure is mounting ever more.
Correct.
Recently, only I was going through this work by Maheshwar Peri and people like him, where they was highlighting that even from the best of the colleges, the students are not succeeding as it used to happen a decade before. So the societal pressure then comes in that even when you are getting all the resources that your previous generation didn't get, then also you are not able to match up to their standards. So the wedge between the two sides is quite visible. And we can say that it will become even more clearer as the decade goes on.
Right.
Given the kind of population that we have, given the number of people who are getting educated, and given the market is not rewarding as it used to reward in a very brief period of time, because the standard has been set high. Again, it had a transformative change, we can say. The market forces gave a very transformative change, and now even when the market forces have gone away, that change cannot be undone.
Correct.
So you cannot go back to the times of 1980s and think that, okay, let's reduce the consumption, reduce the lifestyle of the way we are practicing or we are living, and we can still go back to normal, and the parameters, the benchmark set in can be lowered down. The benchmarks can never be lowered down.
Right.
So suddenly there's a growth. I mean, I don't know whether I don't think there's any data, because I'm not sure whether these studies have happened in India, but if it happens, then there will be more resonating parallels. We see them in the number of people who are applying for a certain limited number of jobs, government jobs.
Correct. That is true. And the earlier book that we discussed on meritocracy,
correct,
it's inevitable that the trajectory of a meritocratic society will follow the same route. And then ultimately the price will be paid by some unfortunate generation, which happens to be Gen Z in this case.
Correct. Because this 1980s was a period of meritocracy in Japan, when the salaried class and the salaried man was seen as the best among everyone, because he got the benefits of the American technology coming in.
Correct.
Him succeeding at market and other jobs, and him even moving out of the country and staying and building a house in, let's say, either in US, UK or places. That has not happened. Similar things have happened with Indians also. The number of Indians who have migrated, once the cream layer of the IITs and the IIMs have gone out, they are no longer, the same cream layer is not able to move out that fast as their previous generation or batches before them have.
Yeah, it's not just about not being able to, but also finding the incentive for that, because it is no longer as lucrative to migrate to America as it once was.
Correct.
So the incentive is less and it is harder. Both things work together, and then so if there is hope against brain drain, it is this
failure of meritocracy. They are not finding America to be the perfect meritocratic state anymore. That was giving them unimaginable mobility.
Yes. And so he comes finally to the question of, or to the great addiction of pornography, which especially threatens the mental health of boys.
Right.
Even 10, 15, 20 years ago, this would be a scandalous statement to make, because at that time, everyone seemed to be going towards the conclusion that these things are the right thing for any society to go for, because liberalism was taking hold of the imagination of people, especially the ones who could make who could express their opinions in public, the elites or the secularists back in the day. But now it's becoming increasingly common to find academics, thinkers, and psychologists like Haidt point the finger at pornography and say that this is one of the most dangerous things that exist out there. Although he also makes a disclaimer saying that no, it's not all pornography is bad, because I'm sure that he'll have people going after him. How can he deny people the pleasure of indulging in sexual?
But he draws a very striking parallel that so what he draws is that the ability of a person to move out and actually date in the real world has reduced. Correct. Because the gratification, the instant gratification and delayed gratification comes into play.
Yeah, correct. So it's the same thing, no? That biological concept of myelination, where and that pattern of neural triggering, whatever that is called. If you connect that with sexual pleasure, then what pornography encourages is very, very different from real world. And the biological, the whole idea of this whole sexual system, the sexual instinct is procreation.
Correct.
Ultimately, that is the objective. But hijacking that to provide instant gratification is what pornography does. Just as hijacking your attention to provide instant gratification in another context is what advertising does. So these are all related ideas and related strategies adopted by corporations through the means of technology to influence individuals who are not protected by the
society or law.
By society or community. Law is only a very sad alternative
of community.
For community.
Correct. So one of the important subtopics is where he presents a chart which says that how many people actually believe in the statement, life often feels meaningless. And he says that more than 20% of boys and girls actually find that statement to be agreeable among the US high school going or high school graduates. And then he quotes the French sociologist Émilie Durkheim, that in 1897 wrote a book on social causes of suicide. A central concept of Durkheim was anomie or normlessness, an absence of stable and widely shared norms and rules. Durkheim was concerned that modernity, with its rapid and disorienting changes and its tendency to weaken the grip of traditional religions, fostered anomie and thus suicide.
Yeah, that's very, very profound. Because ultimately, all meaninglessness, and the sense of loss and nihilism is a direct outcome of not being able to form social bonds. Because man is a social animal, and if you're not able to satisfy that instinct of having a healthy social web of which you are a small part, if that is not there, then nothing would make sense, and there would be a pain deep within your heart, that anxiety.
Correct.
So to that extent, I think while Gen Z may be particularly vulnerable to that kind of anxiety, and thus be labeled as the anxious generation, but this this ailment is not new and was not introduced only to Gen Z. It goes back all the way to where modernity erupted in human societies. And modernity is characterized by being anti-tradition, being anti-religion, being anti-normative, all that, because you just question for the sake of questioning. And this virus of breaking all rules because you can is the actual seed from which this whole tree of massive epidemic of sorts has grown. So yes, nihilism and meaninglessness can only be cured by allowing people to form relationships and form trust bonds. And in that way, a high trust society is extremely, it heals individuals. And it also provides ample opportunity for them to face danger on their own terms and learn from it. And in that way, anti-fragility as an idea is applicable to that setup. But now, with growing technology and this technology being in the service of market forces and optimizing efficiency, all the time. So this culture of gratifying of instant gratification, losing no time in the slow and boring thing called life. Ultimately, it pushes you towards depression only. There is it's quite plain actually, but the way out of it is not so plain, and we really don't know. I mean, I'm not even sure if the prescriptions that he has offered are any, they're just commonsensical. They're basically saying that you return to tradition, and you write it in a different way, but that is what the whole point is. I mean, rites of passage, for example, we have 16 samskaras. Every samskara is in that sense a rite of passage only, that it marks a certain milestone in your life, and it is appropriate for a certain age. So the Upanayan sanskar, for example, is done at the age of 8 or 9, before the kid is, and that whole system of going to the Gurukul, even if it does not exist, at least the sanskara continues, and you remind the child that now this is who you are, and you give them a self-definition, you give them a sense of belonging to the community.
Right.
So all that is extremely important, and what he's asking for is again that
It's kind of similar. He's
it's
just
the same thing.
demarcating that XYZ activities have to be done on this
it's
age
the
and
same
that
thing.
age.
Also, his thing about the internet having no age, and in one of the videos we just shot an analysis video with Professor Bamsi Juluri. He also quotes extensively from this work.
Right.
And he says that at the end he concludes with one of his prescriptions of for curing this disease of meaninglessness and this anxiety is to go back to something like an ashrama system, where every age or the different stages of your life correspond to a certain lifestyle.
Right.
In the modern age, all that is gone. So even older people are depressed. Children are not as
They're
happy.
made to be depressed.
And teenagers are undergoing depression, and they're being pushed towards suicide. Adults find lives meaningless, and they don't derive any satisfaction from. They can't even talk to each other without getting drunk.
Correct.
So overall, it's a terrible situation. But the prescriptions for that are straightforward. But how do we do that? Because we don't have agency.
Agency to do it. Correct.
So this is again a systemic problem that refuses to be solved by any linear method or without profound disruptions or catastrophes.
Since we've mentioned about catastrophic, one catastrophe came a few years back. That was the COVID pandemic. But what happened is that it aggravated the problem entirely. Because an important point that he mentions is that probably Gen Z is the first generation which do not have a real interaction with the community. And their community is an online community which is no community at all, because you are interacting with a mix of people who do not share anything in common. Maybe some interest or for that temporary phase of time. But apart from that, there is no link.
Correct.
And when there's no link, there's no community. And the eventual meaninglessness after the process of pleasure gratification fades away, the meaninglessness and nihilism will eventually strike you.
Yes, because human beings have learned to live together and to flourish on this planet, based on certain axiomatic facts that have been converted into wisdom through culture.
Right.
If you reject that, which is what modernity does, by rejecting tradition, if you reject all that people have so painstakingly built, then you have nothing really to complain about, because you have indulged in that exercise and you've brought it on to yourself. So this is what exactly has happened, and if this is not addressed, now the difficult part is that you can't just switch off a switch.
Correct.
And go back to those times.
As you mentioned, it's not an additive or change. It's a transformative change.
It's a transformative change, and it's now no longer possible to reverse it like that. So you will have to do something which will reconnect you to the cultural wisdom of your ancestors, in the current context, and that, I think, is the clear-cut puzzle to be solved. Which I don't think that we can escape tradition in any way. That is simply impossible. So I think the start would be to first acknowledge it.
Acknowledge, correct. And this book is a perfect acknowledgement in that sense. On that note, we'll take your leave and we'll meet you in our next conversation on another interesting book. Till then, please like the video, share and subscribe to Upword.